Here, so welcome to the white balance mini session, all about white balance. Oh, let me click up here. There we go. Okay, so here's some of the types of items we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about, of course, white balance and what that means to color temperature, auto white balance versus setting it yourself, presets, using it to balance indoor light, shade, fluorescent light, especially setting custom white balance. I think setting custom white balance can be a very important concept for getting more accurate colors and everything. So let's talk about what white balance is a little bit and kind of go over the qualities of light a bit. So the simplest reason is we adjust white balance to get the colors in our image as accurate as we possibly can. Okay, and the reason for that is because different types of lights can have a different color, or we call them a temperature, to them. Okay, so different lights can cast different colors. For example, fluorescence typically can add kind of a bluish cast, although there's tons of different types of fluorescence. So we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about presets. But there's fluorescents that are more green or magenta. They can be all over the place. It can be a little harder with fluorescence. But our typical, real common incandescent light bulbs, tungsten lights, can add kind of a yellowish or an orangish tint, kind of a very, what we call warm tint. And a lot of lights are LED lights nowadays too. You can even get LED bulbs for your home. I have several in my house. With LED lights, what you want to do as we go through this, we'll talk about the actual color temperature numbers. LED lights will usually be rated for an actual color temperature. So I will usually look for ones that are more of a neutral zone, like a daylight balance, but a warmer hue, kind of like incandescent, tends to be a little bit more pleasing, at least to me. And we're more familiar with those incandescent style bulbs. But the main reason with white balance is because all these lights have different color temperatures, we're trying to compensate for that and make sure that our colors aren't skewed in our pictures a certain way. Our eyes automatically adjust to white balance, different color hues, different light sources, and usually so quickly we don't notice too much. Unless you have two totally different lights in the same room, then you can start to see that one's a little bit different color temperature than the other one. So what is color temperature? So color temperature, here's a scale. Color temperature is measured in units of Kelvin, and it's a physical property of light. Now, Kelvin comes from a gentleman with the last name of Kelvin who kind of measured a lot of these. And a lot of the way that this started was with the colors of flame. You know, different heats of flame will give off different colors. So you can have a blue flame or an orange flame from a fire. And, you know, higher temperature flames, actually heat temperature, will change the actual color of the flame or the light they give off. So it turned into this color temperature scale, which we can now use in photography because different types of light sources will give off these different colors. When you have more of a neutral color like here at 5000 K or daylight, what you have is a pretty even balance of all the colors, which gives you more of a pure white light. Then as we go down the scale towards like candlelight 1000 K, it gets warmer and warmer and warmer. We get a more orange light. As we go up towards the higher numbers, 8000 K, 7000 K, we get more blue light. So flash. Flash is on here at 6000 K. A lot of flash nowadays is more in that 5000 to 5500 K, which is generally considered daylight or a pretty neutral white balance. Most LED lights that you buy that are made for photography will be in that 5000 K range, probably somewhere around 5500. But this scale is where I was talking about when you're looking at different LED lights. If you actually buy LED bulbs for your home, a lot of them will be set somewhere in this range. A lot of them will be around, like, let's say 3200, so they're on the warmer side to kind of mimic an incandescent bulb. A lot of fluorescent bulbs will sometimes, you do have fluorescent white in this scale, but a lot of fluorescent, if they're not actually balanced to be white, they will be towards that blue scale. Now, this scale doesn't show the other part of white balance, which we'll talk about, which is called tint, which can actually be a green or magenta. We'll talk about that more later, but a lot of fluorescent bulbs will actually have more of a green or magenta tint too. So it's not always quite on this main temperature scale. Okay, any questions on that? That makes sense with that? Okay, one thing I like to also define too is when we're talking about daylight, daylight white balance actually changes all day long. So it's a little bit of a misnomer when we say daylight. When we're talking about daylight white balance, we're usually talking about 5,000 or 5,500 K. And what we're talking about is daylight at noon. So the sun at the highest point in the sky, and that's usually typically the most neutral. So that's what we're talking about with daylight, because of course in the afternoon, sunset, sunrise, it's going to be totally different. It'll be warmer or cooler depending on the time of day. Okay. So, and I threw this slide in here just to kind of give you an idea of the actual spectrum of light and what we're talking about a little bit too with white balance and how it gets warmer. But you also do have your greens and magentas, and this is kind of our visible light spectrum. So you don't need to worry about the wavelengths here. We do have ultraviolet and infrared off either end, but we're talking about this main visible spectrum that we can see and kind of where that hue tends to go or shift depending on the light source. And while the temperature is usually warmer to cool, like I said, we do have some of that magenta, or we can have that green tint in there as well. Okay, so now that we know what color temperature is. White balance is a little easier to understand because basically what it does is it balances the color temperature in your image. And so the scale in your camera is going to be sort of opposite to that scale that we saw, because what it's doing is it's adding the opposite color in to neutralize it or even it out. So if your photo is coming out bluish because of a bluish light source, it's adding warmth, or it's adding more of an orange temperature to that. If it is too orange or too warm, as we say, then it's going to add more bluish tones to cool it down, to even it out. So it kind of, you can bring it back to neutral, or you can bring it the other way and go a little bit too blue or too warm too. You can go back and forth. And that's really all white balance is doing. But what you'll notice in your camera is the numbers will sort of be opposite to what we just showed. So in here, in our camera, if we start to go up this scale, it actually makes it a little bit warmer or bluer because it's adding the opposite color when we're doing that in our camera. So what I recommend doing, and we're going to try this out, is we're going to play with actually manually setting your white balance in there so you can kind of see it actually change, because it's good to kind of know which way your camera goes and how much it's going to change it. Okay, so the way that we set white balance in our camera is typically through presets. So we have, this is a typical preset setup in our camera, and by default most of our cameras do what's called auto white balance, which is trying to mimic kind of what our eyes do for us automatically. It's looking at all the different light coming in, it's looking at the scene, and it tries to kind of make it more of a neutral color. Auto white balance isn't always perfect, but it does a pretty good job nowadays. Some of our cameras have different settings for auto white balance to try and skew it towards a more neutral white, or depending on the type of lighting situation we're in. But if we want something a little more accurate and we know exactly what light source we have and roughly what temperature it might be, then we do have some presets in here. So when you can get away from auto white balance and use a preset, sometimes you can get more accurate colors and you can have a more accurate white balance. So a few of these are of course daylight, which like we said is daylight at noon. So when we do have a nice bright day, it's somewhere around noon, we know we can do a daylight preset and it should be pretty accurate. We do have tungsten incandescent. So if you have those warmer incandescent bulbs, this will neutralize that, fix that, so we have a nice neutral color. We have fluorescent. Now the problem with fluorescent, like I was saying, is most of our cameras, some of our cameras only have the one fluorescent setting, but there's many kinds of fluorescent bulbs depending on the gas and technology they used in there. So fluorescent doesn't always work unless some newer cameras have like 3 or 4 or 5 fluorescent modes. You can actually set it for the right type of fluorescent bulb. And of course, it can be kind of hard to tell exactly. You don't always know which fluorescent bulb you're dealing with. So sometimes you kind of have to play with it and see if it's coming out real purple. Then you try and pick the fluorescent preset that matches that. I don't use that one as much. I use more of a custom white balance and things like that. I'll show you how we're going to take more control of this. But the presets will get you there in a pinch. If you are outside and you have open shade, then you do have a shade preset, and you also have a cloudy preset. Almost all cameras have those too as well. So if it's an overcast day, you want to try the cloudy one typically.
It's nice to be back.
And then we also have flash. Flash preset is actually usually almost the same as daylight. So
both stores are open now, so customers can come in.
The flash preset is usually about the same as daylight. They're usually both around 5,500 Kelvin, roughly, because most flash units today are set to around a 5,500 Kelvin, a pretty neutral white balance, so that it's especially easy to balance with daylight, and you've got a pretty neutral white, or even colors coming out across the board pretty much. Okay, so let's talk about auto white balance and especially why we want to get away with it. So one joke we talk about with auto white balance is always wrong balance. And the reason we say that is it's never going to be perfect. It's not always as bad or extreme as in this example, but it can definitely get skewed by certain things. You know, it's trying to look at your scene through the camera and the different light sources, and it tries to give you a neutral white balance. But if there are all kinds of different objects in your scene, especially of different colors, if there's nothing that's like a neutral gray or a white in your scene, or you just have several different types of lights that are warm and cool, then it's going to try and give you something in between probably, and you're not going to really get a proper white balance. The other problem with auto white balance is it will fluctuate every single shot you take. So every time you let go of that shutter button and then you press that shutter button again, it will reevaluate the white balance, kind of like if you're on an auto exposure mode, it will reevaluate the exposure too, and it will give you a slightly different white balance. So if nothing's changing too much, it might only fluctuate a little bit, but every single one of those pictures, hey Scott, how's it going? Welcome in. Every single one of those pictures will most likely have slightly different tones or slightly different warm or cool tones, different white balances. So that's the only problem with auto white balance. Now, like I said, a lot of current cameras do a pretty decent job with this in most situations. And I've noticed on some newer cameras, besides just having auto white balance, you might also have like an auto white balance pure white or an auto white balance natural light or daylight or things like that. So sometimes they have other ways you can try and get the auto white balance to be a little more accurate. And if you're in a situation where the light's changing a lot and you just don't have time to change presets all the time or set a custom one all the time, then that's fine. By all means, use auto white balance, but just keep this in mind. Okay, just some more examples. So here's set to auto white balance on the left, and here's set to shade because this was in shade. And you can see that it did warm the photo up a little bit. It's a little closer to the actual light that we have there. And you notice that the colors in the flower get a little bit more vivid. So while it does affect how warm or cool our picture of, it can also just kind of get our general colors overall a little bit more accurate so that everything looks right. So you can kind of see that in the flowers there. Looks a little bit better, I think. So here's another one, auto white balance versus cloudy. So you can see the auto white balance, because remember the auto white balance is trying to kind of neutralize things to kind of a neutral gray or white-ish white balance. And it might take out colors that were actually part of the photo. So here if we actually set it to cloudy, you can see a lot of the color comes back into the sky, a little bit more accurate to how the scene actually looked. Whereas the auto white balance saw all these other hues and colors, and you've also got, it's trying to neutralize, I think especially on the white buildings here, and it kind of took a lot of color out of the picture. So you get a little bit more saturation by setting it to the proper white balance in this case too. So presets, so back to presets, are just going to get you a little bit closer and especially more consistent than auto white balance. If you have a preset that you can use that is basically working and it's accurate for the situation, then the nice thing is you know that every single time you're taking that shot, that white balance is staying the same. So each one of your shots is going to be more consistent. You're going to just have more accurate white balance too, if the preset is within that range, if it's close enough to your light source. If you have mixed light sources, you can only set white balance for one or the other. Remember that too. And we'll talk about mixing flash and ambient light a little bit and things like that as well. But just keep in mind, you only have one white balance setting you can really do. So sometimes you do have to kind of pick and choose what your main light source is going to be in that situation. But presets are a great way to play with that. So white light has all colors in there equally, and that's where color temperature kind of comes into play. So when you add the opposite color to the image, it brings the temperature back to neutral. So kind of like we were talking about, your camera is adding the opposite color. So instead of whites appearing blue or orange, they should appear white after correctly white balancing an image. You have to be careful with this sometimes too. When we talk about the custom white balance, if you just use certain things that look white to us, they might not actually be a neutral white or a pure white. They might have some hue to them, and the camera could get confused by that. But generally this applies, and the whites shouldn't be blue or orange if you have a white in your image. So here's some examples. Indoors, with the color temperature of the light very orange, we need to add blue. So it's a lower Kelvin number. Okay, so here on the left, right here, we have it towards the orange. So we're going to add a lower Kelvin number to add the opposite color in there. So here's an example of that. So on the left-hand side, now here's an example of two different light sources though too. So our primary subject is the statue. So the statue on the left-hand side is very warm because the lighting in there is an incandescent style of light. So if we set our white balance for incandescent, it adds blue to cancel out that warmth effect from the lighting, and our statue now it looks pretty good, right? But look what happened to the lighting behind the statue. That went kind of blue. So we have some other kind of light out there, either a shade or maybe a fluorescent lighting or something like that. So you can't do both. You only can set one or the other, which can be a problem sometimes in mixed lighting. But in this case, we set it for our subject, our primary subject, so that it is properly lit and has the proper colors and everything. It's not all warm or bluish. Okay, so sometimes you do run into that. You can use gels sometimes if you are mixing your own lighting, but if it's lighting you can't control, there's not a whole lot you can do, unfortunately. Especially in public buildings, sometimes you might have different bulbs that were replaced in different areas and you get mixed lighting. Okay, so just another example, just to kind of keep going over this. So outdoors, in the shade, the color temperature is very blue. Shade makes a much bluer, cooler look. So we want to add orange. So we raise the Kelvin number in the camera. Okay, so we're raising somewhere in the camera over here, 7,000-8,000, so that we're adding warmth or an oranger color to an already kind of blue light to bring it back to more of a neutral so that we're not getting that cool color cast, that blue color cast. Okay, pretty simple, right? So here's another example. Now this one also actually has a little bit of green in it too, which is another thing we're going to talk about, the tint, because that also comes into play. Excuse me. But here we have on the left-hand side, it's fairly cool and a little bit green. And then on the right, we've added warmth and brought it back to be a little bit more neutral. You can especially look at the white in her sleeves, but it also gives a little bit more warmth to skin tone. I think warmer pictures, I mean, you can be creative with this too. You can always make a picture a little bit warmer or cooler to taste. But I think warmer pictures tend to bring out skin tones a little bit better and looks better for portraits and stuff like that as well. Okay, so before we talk about tint though, before we get into that a little bit more, does everybody have their cameras with them? Does anybody have a camera they can follow along with?
Yes, on camera.
Okay, so what I'd like to do if we can, if you can go onto your camera, and I want to find your white balance settings, if you're able to follow along here. So I want you to let me know, let's go one at a time. So let me know which camera you have with you, and let's get the white balance settings going, because I want to play with switching off of auto white balance, check out the presets, and then we'll talk about setting it manually as well. So Kathleen, you want to go first?
Sure.
Yeah, so go for it. Do you know where your white balance button is on there?
Yes.
Okay. So you probably have auto white balance, and what are some of the presets that you have?
Oh, I have incandescent,
Okay.
daylight,
Mm-hmm.
usual. It's a D700.
D700, yeah, Nikon.
Flash, shade, and cloudy and shade.
Okay.
And Kelvin numbers.
Okay, cool. So the Kelvin numbers are what I want to talk about during this class too, because that's where you can directly, not all cameras will let you do this, but when you can dial in the Kelvin numbers, that can be really nice because you can literally dial in that whole scale we talked about earlier and get outside of those presets. You can almost sort of create your own preset. So if incandescent gets you close, but the bulbs around you aren't quite matching up, then you can kind of use the Kelvin scale to skew it up or down from there until it looks just right. Some cameras will even give you like a color grid where you can change all the way from green, magenta to warm to cool and all that too, and really dial things in. But hopefully most of you at least have kind of a Kelvin scale or kind of a custom, which we'll talk about in a little bit too. So So Kathleen, since you know how to do that, I'm going to go on to the next person. And then what I want everybody to do is what we can, if you want to kind of see how this works a little bit, if you haven't done this before, is set your camera to auto white balance and take a picture. Hopefully you're in some artificial lights or you have some window light coming in. Just take a picture somewhere in your room or out the window with auto white balance, and then switch it to something totally wrong like incandescent or fluorescent or shade, depending on the light sources around you, and just watch what happens and play with a few of them and see what it does to the colors in your photo. So while Kathleen's doing that, let's go down to Kathy.
I have my old camera here that was sitting here, so that's a D80.
D80?
So it has the basics.
Okay.
Incandescent, fluorescent, direct sunlight, flash, cloudy, shade.
Okay. Okay, perfect.
D600 somewhere else, but.
Okay, that should be pretty similar.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Well, it also has the color temperature.
Oh, good. Perfect. Okay, good. Yeah, hopefully everybody has that because I want to try and play with that in a little bit here too. So keep that in mind where that's at. And try the same thing, Kathy. Try taking a picture on auto white balance, either just in your room with the artificial lights, or if you have a window where you can include some natural light, and then try setting it to something crazy like incandescent and fluorescent, something totally opposite, and then see what that does to the pictures.
Okay.
All right. All right, next one down I have here is Ray. I think Ray just joined in too, so welcome, Ray, if you can hear me. And Scott, I think, is working, so we'll let him keep working. And Shelly, I know you're working too, so you might not be able to join in here. But if you guys are able to, or Shelly, if you have your camera there, and Ray, if you have your camera there, see if you can find your white balance settings. If you can't, let me know. If you can't talk on the microphone, then you can always talk in chat too. I'm keeping an eye on that. So, okay. All right, cool. So, all right, just want to get you started on that. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the other parts to white balance, because some of them don't follow just that orange and blue shift, that warm to cool temperatures. Okay, so some of them, like especially fluorescent lights, they either heat a filament or they have gases. A lot of fluorescents use a type of gas, and you get other colors, especially like green and magenta, or mixtures of the warmth and the green and magenta. Okay, so here's one that's shot at 5500K, which is kind of a daylight balance. And it's not so much that it's that warm or cool, but it's has a very green tint. I don't know how easily it shows up through the share through here. And it can depend on our monitors, unfortunately, when we're using a computer. But it's kind of a greenish tint. It can be subtle sometimes. So that's where tint comes into play. It's usually a green to magenta scale. And here's if we take that same 5500. So we didn't change that main Kelvin scale, but we just shifted it towards magenta. So again, we're adding in the opposite color. So if we have a picture that's showing up a little greenish, then we might need to add a little magenta. If it's showing up kind of magenta, we might need to add a little green. So we're always just kind of balancing with the opposite. Okay, so you can see there without changing the color scale. Now, not all cameras are going to let us customize this. Some cameras will let us give a kind of a grid or give a little bit of a green and magenta shift. I recommend looking it up in your manual and seeing if there's an option for this once we get into more of the manual or custom white balance. If you can't find it, just email me after the class. Let me know the camera you're working with, and I'll help you find that or see if it can do that at all. So typically this will be built into the presets, or if you do a fully custom white balance where it reads it off of an object we're going to talk about, then it can grab it from there and it will fix that. But just so you know that it's there, because you might not always see that warm to cool tones. And this is an example of a camera that has kind of a grid that it gives you. So some cameras will give you an option kind of like this. Sometimes it's more of a menu option. It's not a grid like this, but this makes it easy to see. But here's where you have your warmer and your cooler tones, but you also have some of your magentas and your greens. So you can shift it all different directions here to get rid of whatever color cast you might be seeing in your picture and give it more of a neutral white balance. So, and these would all still be considered at that 5500K setting. You're kind of modifying it off of that. So, or if you were at 3200K and that gave you the right cool or warm tones, and then you still needed to adjust the greens or magentas a little bit. Okay, so tint is also a very important part. You don't run to it quite as much as the cool to warm tones, but it is there. So let's talk a little bit more about accuracy and especially custom white balance. So custom white balance is really where it's at if you want the most accurate possible. Okay, so here's an example where we've got auto white balance, and we have then a tungsten white balance, and then we have a custom white balance. And which one looks the best? You know, the custom white balance, you have much more pure whites in those white objects, like the little tray here and the paper and even the light source here, okay? So that's where the presets come sometimes, and the presets work a lot of times, but not every single light bulb is exactly the same or exactly is gonna follow these rules and be the exact same as your preset. So sometimes even a preset will be slightly off, or maybe it gets the Kelvin right, but you have kind of a green or a little bit of a magenta tint from that bulb as well. So custom is really the most accurate way to go. I know it's not always possible because sometimes you don't have time to do that in every situation. And like I said, auto white balance can be pretty good. But let's talk about a couple ways that you can kind of get a custom white balance. And I'll talk about how you can kind of set that up in your camera. But basically a custom white balance, and there's two ways you can kind of do a custom white balance. So let me explain this before we get into this a little bit more, because I'm talking about, when I say custom white balance, I'm talking about a specific feature. But you do have that Kelvin scale. So you can sort of customize your white balance using your Kelvin scale. And then if it lets you also do a custom tint, green or magenta shift as well, then you can dial it in manually yourself. And you can dial in the Kelvin temperature and then shift it green or magenta. And you could get a very similar result to here. It would probably take some test shots though. So you'd have to take a picture, kind of see if it's a little too cool or too warm, a little green or magenta, and then you kind of adjust your Kelvin or your custom settings from there. When I'm talking about custom white balance, most cameras will have a separate setting from that Kelvin scale called custom, or maybe a preset, a different kind of preset. It depends. I've seen Nikon sometimes call it pre. Basically what you're doing is you're actually using specific tools, like an Expo disc here, or you've probably heard of a gray card, or like a neutral gray card, like a white balance card. You're using something like this so that the camera can actually read the light in the scene and get a custom white balance off of that object. So you're giving it something that it knows is accurately a neutral gray or a neutral white. More a neutral gray than white though, but you can sort of use a white card as well. So you have two things. You have an Expo disc and a white card, or what's more common is a gray card too. White cards will work as long as you know that they're a photographic one and they are neutral, because a lot of things like paper is not always actually a fully neutral white. So let me explain the Expo disc first though. So what we're looking to do when we do a custom white balance in our camera, and some cameras do it differently, but typically you're either taking a picture with your camera and then you're telling your camera to use the information from that picture to set a custom white balance, or some cameras will let you you don't take the picture ahead of time, you kind of go through the custom white balance settings and it has you take a picture or read the data through that setting so that it gets the information it needs to make a custom white balance. And what it's looking for with the custom white balance is a neutral gray picture or frame, or a neutral gray or white object in your scene that you're telling it to use that. So what an Expo disc does is you hold it in front of your lens and you take a picture through it, and it gives you a neutral gray picture. You have to get your exposure right, so you do have to play with your exposure. It will change your exposure a little bit, but as long as you get it bright enough, it's not too dark or too overly blown out white, you'll get either a neutral gray or it's kind of a neutral white picture. And then you can go into your custom white balance in your camera and tell it to use that picture for white balance. The more common way is with a white or a gray card. And these are made for photography so that they're a neutral color. And the way this typically works, and there's two ways you can do this, is you go into your custom white balance settings in your camera, and some of them will make you take a picture, and you take a picture of the card mostly filling the frame, or through the preset, the custom white balance settings, it'll ask you to select a target and you fill the frame with that card or most of the frame, and it will use the light bouncing off that card to determine what the custom white balance will be. So that with the gray card or the white card, you want it to be in the scene that you're taking the picture of, in the same area that you kind of want it to see the light from. So if you're taking a portrait, for example, you'd want to kind of hold it up near their face or have it over in front of them so that it's getting the same light as the subject in your picture. The nice thing about the Expo disc is you don't necessarily have to have somebody holding it or out over in the scene. It's reading all the light coming off of the scene into the camera through the lens and giving you a neutral frame through the expo disc. So it's just a couple different ways to do that. And we're going to talk about in a second. I want to go through everybody's cameras that can and make sure that we can go through this so you see how to do this, because this can be really an important thing to know how to do. And it's good to kind of learn how to do it so you can do it fairly quickly. So if you're in a situation and you need to set this up real quick, it's second nature. One thing about doing a custom white balance too is every time the light changes too much, you need to redo it. You know, so if you move from one room to another with different bulbs, then you need to redo your custom white balance. If it's during daylight and the sun is of course always moving, you know, every hour or so you might need to redo your custom white balance. Okay, so here's another example of another tool. This is a very, this is more than just white balance. It's also a color checker, which is why it's named that by X-Rite. So it does have a few things in here for color balance. It has white balance grays, and it also has whites and blacks. So the idea is this one is you can use it for white balance, but it also has some different grays. So if you want your white balance to come out a little bit warmer or cooler, depending on the subject, like for example, on a portrait, maybe you want it a little bit warmer just because it looks nicer for the person. So you can kind of trick your custom white balance using a card like this. And it has all the other colors. That's a little bit more for on the computer. So you can actually use software and it can read all the different color swatches, and you can kind of fix things even more and make sure that everything's kind of calibrated so you're getting accurate colors. One thing about using a white or a gray card or a color checker is you can sort of cheat with these a little bit if you want to. And now this only works if you're shooting RAW. So one thing actually I wanted to bring up too is if you're shooting RAW versus JPEG, if you take a RAW picture, your white balance, it's nice to have it set ahead of time, but it's not as critical because your white balance is not cooked into a RAW file. You can always change the white balance after the fact. So if auto white balance messes things up with the RAW file through a RAW editor on the computer, you'll notice if you open a RAW file, you can actually change the Kelvin scale after the fact. You can even change the tint after the fact. So if you use Lightroom, or most RAW editors will give you this, you'll have a Kelvin and a tint slider, and you can completely change it. And you'll have different presets built in too. So you'll still have like daylight and shade and flash presets built into your RAW conversion. So if you're shooting with RAW, you can change this after the fact. It's not detrimental at all. It's not built into a RAW file. If you shoot in JPEG, you can still change it, but it is cooked into the JPEG. So it won't really give you a Kelvin scale most of the time. It just kind of gives you minus 100 to plus 100 scale, something like that, depending on the software, where you can still change it a lot. And it still doesn't hurt it that much with the JPEG, but it's not always quite as much leeway. So the cool thing though is if you use a gray card or something like a color checker, then you can always use that to set your white balance after the fact. So if you don't have time to mess with custom white balance in your camera, what you can do is just have somebody hold the gray card up and take your first picture, and then take the rest of your pictures and leave your camera on auto white balance the whole time. And then when you get to your computer, you can use a little dropper for white balance in Lightroom, for example, and you just click that dropper on that gray card in that first picture, and it'll set the white balance off of that, and then you apply that white balance to all your other pictures. So you don't always have to do it ahead of time in the camera, but if you want to see the most accurate results in the camera as you're shooting, that's when you would want to do the custom white balance. But if you're shooting RAW and you use one of these, you can always do it after the fact. So does that make sense how I explained that? Any questions on that? Okay. So I will use these tools in both ways, but sometimes I'm feeling lazy and the auto white balance is working good enough, and I'll just make sure and remember to take that first picture with somebody holding the gray card or that gray card in my scene, or I do have an expo disc, and then I'll just set it after the fact in Lightroom using the RAW files. It's just sometimes quicker. And then there's times where I will set it really quickly on the custom, especially if the light's not changing a lot. Just remember that always that you got to redo the white balance if the light changes. Okay, so before we go on, let's have everybody that can, I want you to play with setting your custom white balance. So we talked about Kelvin and presets. But let's go to Kathleen, because you're at the top of my list there, and I see you on camera there. I'm going to turn on my camera. All right. So Kathleen, you have the D700, right?
Yes.
Okay. So let's find, you should have a custom white balance on there.
Yeah, under the shooting menu, I have white balance,
Okay.
and the preset, it has all of the options.
Yeah, so for Nikon, the custom is a lot of times kind of called a pre. I know we have the presets in our camera, but it kind of calls it a pre under for custom. Like you can set different ones too. A lot of times the Nikons will have like pre 1, pre 2, pre 3, possibly. You might only have one. Certain ones do have more than one. I was gonna see here, but you should be able to do a custom. And the way that it typically I think works on the Nikons is you have to go into the custom section, and then it will ask you to pick a frame that you already have, or it'll also sometimes let you take the frame right there. So you can kind of do it either way. So I was just going to bring up, do you see that in there at all?
See what now?
Do you see the custom or the preset?
Okay, just a minute.
Yeah.
So the one where I choose from photos already in my camera is under the retouch menu, and it's called color balance.
Okay. Well, you know, that's the retouch menu. That might be, that's usually
Right.
for, that's,
Okay.
the retouch menu in a Nikon is more, it's almost like editing your pictures in the
Okay.
camera.
And then up on the shooting menu, I do have white balance, and it says for free. But it shows
Okay.
of all the options, you know, incandescent forms, etc., plus preset manual and the colors.
Perfect. Yeah, so that pre is your custom one. It's kind of in the same list as all of the other ones. I'm going to find you a little guide here so we can kind of walk through it. And this will apply for anybody else that has a Nikon camera, and then we'll take a look at other cameras, Canon, Fuji, things like that. I just wanted to find here, because so you have to go into your main menu typically to actually set the custom white balance, and it will let you define what that pre is. So if you go into your main menu and then go to the shooting menu, the little camera, and then we're going to look for the white balance setting in there.
Got it?
Okay. So
Yeah.
then what option is it showing there? Do you have the pre in there?
Yes. Preset manual.
Yeah, okay. So if you click right on that, I believe, it should let you get into some settings for that. And do you have like,
D0,
what's that?
it has D0, D1.
Perfect. So those are the different ones. So it's mostly because you could assign a different picture to each one type of thing.
Okay.
So if you had D0 set for something that you're using in the studio a lot, then you could just change D1 on the fly. I usually just typically would use just D0, and I'm just going to change that every time because not typically in a situation where it's always going to be the same for one of those.
Okay.
So let me bring up, here we go. So I'm just going to bring this up onto the screen. So this is just specifically for the D700. Can you see that there?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to bring this up because all the Nikons can be a little differently. So you can have up to the 5 presets on there. Basically what you're usually going to do is you can click on one of those. So you should be able to, and it has little guides. So see down below on here, it should give you little guides like OK set, middle button to select, or sometimes it's the right arrow.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it letting you select a picture from your camera roll?
No,
Okay.
they're all empty.
Okay. Yeah, they might be empty right now. Let me see. I just wanted to see, because they're all a little bit different. I was trying to remember exactly the best way that you can do it from there. You do have fine tuning, by the way, on the D700. So you can do that. But basically, here we go. Here you go. Okay. Yeah, so you select preset manual, then you select D0, for example,
Right.
and then it should give you a menu that it shows right here. Let me see if I can zoom this in a little bit. See where it says set under D0?
Yes.
Wow.
So if you click set on that,
Wait. Okay.
so if you click set on that, then it should let you actually pick a frame from your camera, or it might let you take a picture.
Okay, wait. Okay, I'm not, let me, just a minute.
No, that's fine. Yeah, let me see if I can.
Okay, set, and then I go right, and I'm getting
Yep.
the grid, color grid.
You're getting the color grid on it?
Yeah, and then some options. I can set that, set it.
Yeah.
So let me see here on yours.
On my Nikon, I have to hold the OK button down, like long press it, and it brings me to be able to set mine.
Okay, yeah, and I was gonna check because some of the Nikons have a separate OK button. I think the D700 might have a separate one. Does it have a different one besides the multi-selector, the one in the middle? There might be an OK button.
Yeah, no, I pressed the separate OK button.
Oh, okay. And that didn't go into it?
Let's see, let me try again. Yeah, either way, I come up with that grid.
Okay.
And then,
So there might be an easier way. I think the D700 is a little different than some of the ones I'm used to. So here's a little guide on measuring it up on the screen. So it basically says you want to have that neutral gray or white object under lighting that will be used, kind of like we talked about with the gray card. And what you're going to do, so you can actually use a quick key on yours. So if you press that WB button
yeah, I
and
can do
change,
that too.
okay, and then change that main command dial until it goes to preset.
Yeah.
Pre and probably says like D0.
Yeah, D1.
Okay, that's fine too. So then to measure it, it says you release the WB button briefly, and then press and hold the button until the pre icon starts to flash.
Right.
Okay. So it should also appear in the control panel. And now you just measure it with, it looks like, yeah, the shutter button. So before the indicator stops flashing, frame the reference object so it fills the viewfinder and press the shutter release button all the way down. So it doesn't actually record a photograph, it's just recording that white balance information.
Okay, right.
Okay?
Okay.
Yeah, and it says even when it's not in focus. So that's the easy way to do it on the D700.
Okay.
So, and I think you can rotate, once you rotate the back dial to pre, I think you can rotate the front dial to change between like D1, D0, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then you can just do that method we just did so you can set that white balance really quickly.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
I thought that one had a quick way to do it.
Okay, that image you had is right out of the D700 manual?
Yeah, I just wanted to find some pictures on that. But that's in the
Okay.
D700 manual under setting the custom white balance. Yeah.
Okay, I got that.
Yeah,
Okay.
perfect. Okay, cool. All right, so who wants to go next? Anybody else have their camera, want to try this out?
I've already done it on mine.
Okay, which one did you have again, Scott?
The Z6,
Perfect. Okay, cool. Was it pretty similar? I think you can do yours through the menu too, right?
you go through the I menu, and
Yeah.
then you click on the pre, and then you got to hold down the OK button,
Okay,
and then another screen pops up to take a picture of something that's white or gray.
perfect. Okay, cool. All right, good. All right, so Scott's good too. Yeah, and that's really handy. So it, like what we saw with Kathleen's, the manual says like you have to fill the frame with that gray card. So it can be kind of hard sometimes with like landscapes if you have like a little thing out there and you want it to get the same light that's hitting the mountain and everything. That's one reason I like something like the Expo disc, because the Expo disc you just hold in front of your lens and it's seeing all the light in the entire scene coming through that Expo Disc, and the Expo Disc is just made so that it gives you a clean, neutral, gray or white frame. And so it would work the same way, except for instead of having to move the camera or zoom in and fill the frame with a gray card or a white card, then you can just hold that in front of it and you're good to go. So.
Yeah, for my area is the same as what I have it set for my focus. So.
Oh, okay.
Small box, it's a small box. It's a big box. It's a big box.
Okay, so you can read off a smaller object too.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really handy. Some cameras will do that and they'll only read off like a center area or medium size or tiny areas. Yeah, and that definitely makes it easier, especially if a portrait, somebody's standing 10 feet away, they can hold up the little card. You can just take it off of that real quick. So, or sometimes I'll just do it after the fact too, but that's awesome. All right, now how about Kathy, did you want to try that? Do you see that there?
Oh, no, I'll just use when Ronnie gets home, I'll look at my manual.
Okay, cool. Well, let me know if you have any trouble finding that.
It's a Nikon, so.
Okay, yeah, it should be pretty similar to Kathleen and Scott's, either through the info menu or through that white balance button.
Right, I agree.
And let's see, how about Ray, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Did you want to try that? Which camera did you have?
I have the Canon 77D.
Okay. Do you know how to do the
and
custom
it
white
looks really
balance? Or-
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've taken several pictures with it on different settings and played
Mhm.
with the custom.
Cool.
The custom, wow, that really can fine tune it.
Yeah, custom's really nice. Custom will really, that's always going to be the most accurate. So when you really want to know or you really want to make sure, then that's the way to go. Otherwise, I get real familiar with just that Kelvin scale too, though, because then that can be really handy too. Sometimes I'll just play with that if I forgot my Expo Disc or something and I just want to be able to try and get it right. Because the nice thing about digital is we can play too, right? It doesn't cost us to take pictures, so we can always take a reference picture and skew it warmer or cooler from there. So, and then I know Shelly's at work, so she probably can't do that. But if you guys have any trouble with that too, if you ever want to see an Expo Disc, we are open in the store now too, so we can always jump into that. And I can show you how one of those work and we can play with one of those. All right, let me go back up here. So the Color Checker Passport is actually one of the next tools that I want to get personally. I would probably use that a little bit more after the fact with software, but it can really help you out, and it has a lot of guides on how to use the different swatches on here because they literally have different, so you can kind of see the little mountains here or the little people. So because white balance doesn't always have to be like some perfect white balance always off a gray card. There are times where maybe you want it to be a little cooler or a little warmer. Some people just have a taste where they want their pictures, their photographs in general, to have that artistic look and look a little bit warmer or cooler. Like I said, for portraits, a lot of times I think a little bit warmer, skewing things a little bit warmer than maybe what the natural neutral white balance would be can look nice. But sometimes with landscapes, a little bit cooler look can be nice too. So you can have creative white balances, and that's what this gives you here. You kind of have a portrait line here, and you have a landscape line. And it's hard to see, but you can almost see on here a little bit of warmer to cooler in these swatches. And so you can kind of use that to skew things a certain way. And if you know that you'll like a certain one, then you know that you can tell your camera to set your white balance off of one of those. Now these are a little bit smaller, so they don't always work with the white balance in your camera, depending on the camera, if it needs to fill the frame. But this is something where I would be shooting in RAW, and I would take a shot of this in my frame, so having somebody hold it, or it's a little harder with landscape, but if you can set it somewhere in the scene so some of the natural light's hitting it and it's not too small, but I can basically take just a picture of that in the scene and then take it away and take the rest of my pictures the rest of the time, maybe in auto white balance or maybe in just daylight or whatever is the closest preset. And then on my computer, when I get into Lightroom, there's that little dropper tool. So you click that dropper, you go to the picture that has this in it, and you click the dropper on the one that you want, and it will set your white balance based off that, and you get that slightly warmer or cooler, or the ones in the middle are usually more of a neutral. They also have the pure neutral ones here on the right-hand side. And then the software also has add-ins for Lightroom and certain other programs that will read all these other color swatches and can fix other color issues sometimes too, so it's more accurate. So that's something that I want to get next. They are really nice. Okay, so just a few things to remember. We joke about auto white balance being always wrong balance, but auto is okay in most situations. And like I said, most cameras do a decent enough job. Especially if you're shooting in RAW, it doesn't matter that much anyways. You can always change it after the fact. So there's nothing wrong with leaving it in there if you don't know or if the lighting is changing. Presets can be closer if the lights follow that rule. So know your presets and then learn custom, and custom is always going to be the best. Okay. So that's pretty much all there is to white balance. The biggest part about it is going to be learning that camera and learning how to set those different things and how your camera reacts. I would definitely check and see if your camera has different fluorescent modes, and then I would look in the manual and see what they mean, because they won't always be labeled in the camera. They'll just be labeled like fluorescent 1, 2, 3, and 4. I know Scott on the newer Z series, those definitely have like, I think there might be even more than 5. It's got several different fluorescent presets in there. So if you go into your manual, it'll actually tell you what each one of those is for, and you can definitely customize those too. And I know, Kathleen, even on your D700, it does have that custom grid that we kind of showed. And most of the Canons and Sonys will have that too. So play with that, because you can always set up your own kind of custom presets as well for different situations, especially if you're shooting in consistent lights, or if you're doing things where you're using your own lights and you have a certain look that you want, or you can dial those in. So that's the biggest part, I think, after that. The white balance itself is not too bad, right? That makes sense with that?
Yeah.
So, and play with those numbers too, because that's one thing that I'm just going to go back real quick here. Go all the way back. So this scale here, it can be a little confusing for photography, because on our cameras it actually goes opposite. If we go up to a higher number on our camera, it will make it warmer and warmer. So don't worry too much about this scale. I just get used to what your camera does. You know, if you go from 5,500 up to like 6,000, 7,000, your picture is going to get warmer. If you go down to like 3,200, it gets bluer, because it's adding the opposite color. So it kind of doesn't match the true temperature scale of light out there in the world. So keep that in mind, because that was something when I first started was very confusing at first when I first learned to this scale. So cool. All right. Well, any other questions, things like that? All right. Well, this is recorded.
Question.
Yeah.
Not on white balance. Do you ever talk about monitors?
Oh, we can talk about that. Yeah. I don't typically.
Class or anything?
We haven't really had too much of a class, but that is definitely something to consider, because perfecting all the white balance in the world can be fine for the camera and everything else, and it will help with printing and things like that. But if your monitor is way off, it might skew things too. And even if you set the custom white balance and maybe the picture's set right, it might look off on your monitor. Now, part of that we can never get around if we're posting stuff online, because we never know what monitor somebody's looking at our pictures on, you know, on their screen or at their home computer or a laptop, stuff like that. I found that's one thing sort of nice about Apple computers. Their monitors tend to be fairly accurate. There's nicer monitors out there by like BenQ and things like that that are made specifically for photography. But what you really want to do if you want accurate colors out of your monitors, you want to color calibrate your monitor. This is especially important with printing, but it can also just mean that when you're editing, you know that they're probably going to be more consistent. Like I said, you can't control somebody else's, but you know that you're seeing it right. You do have to calibrate your printer typically too at the same time if you're printing yourself. But I've typically found if you have a color calibrated monitor and you're sending off to a print shop like Bay Photo or one of those big places, then you'll probably be fine and it's going to come out right. And they also will kind of double check for any issues too. All of their stuff is very calibrated. So to calibrate your monitor, you need a color calibration device. Here, I'm going to bring one up on the screen that we've had here. There's a couple different companies. The main one that I know of is the X-Rite, which is the same guys that make that color checker passport I was talking about. There's another company too.
The two people that we decided on, Mrs. Trout and I, to recognize for history. These have been great learners in the classroom.
All right.
And great learners through distance learning as well, and been participants and the things that have.
All right, so X-Rite, let me see if I can find, let's see. So X-Rite color calibration and profiling, and they have their professional families, but let me see if they have the Color Monkey still. So there's the color checkers. They might have renamed it since the last time I did it. So this is probably the new version of it. It was called a Color Monkey before. It looks like this little guy here. Let me see if they got a bigger picture of it. Here we go. There we go. Color Monkey display. So this guy right here, so it looks like they did get rid of it. So you probably have to go to the Display Pro. So it's a little bit more expensive nowadays. It's basically a type of thing called a colorimeter, and I don't know if they have a good picture over here. So it looks like that. And one side of it is actually a sensor, and you literally hang it in front of your monitor. So it would hang down right in the middle of your monitor, and it has a pad, so it sits on there nice and flush, and it can read the light coming off your monitor. And then you run their software, and it will just flash a bunch of different colors through your monitor so that it can read them. And it generates a profile for your computer with more accurate colors then. So it can fix any warm or cool hues that your monitor might be giving off. Some monitors you can adjust this in the monitor a little bit too. I've seen sometimes where the color calibration unit can only go so far, but maybe the monitor's so warm or cool that it can't quite fix it, and you have to go into the monitor settings and maybe bring it a little closer first, and that can help too. But you can see the picture right here. That's a great example. It kind of hangs out over your monitor like that.
Okay.
So I do recommend something like that. I think the other company that makes these is called Spyder, S-P-Y-D-E-R, I believe. Let me see. Yeah, these guys here. So I haven't used those ones though. I've used more of the X-Rite ones right here. It's too bad they don't. I'll have to see if they have any other products, because the Color Monkey was much more affordable, more like $60 to $70 than $300. So maybe they're coming out with something new, or maybe they have something else I haven't heard of yet. But I would check out X-Rite's stuff. The cool thing about the X-Rites too is they typically will have, so there you can see the sensor right there. That's what goes up against your monitor. But they actually have a top piece to them. I don't know if they have a picture of it. So that outer part that's kind of gray there, that's actually a little bit of a light sensor too, because what it does is if you have a situation where you can leave it connected to your computer, you set that out on your desk, and it will watch the lighting in your room, because as the lighting in your room changes with different bulbs or things like that, or if you have natural light coming through a window, it might skew the way that your monitor colors look to you, and so it can kind of read that and kind of help readjust your monitor as you go. I never really use that feature a whole lot. It's usually pretty accurate. You do want to color calibrate your monitor often, so you're going to do it. You're not going to just do it once and never do it again. You might do it once a month or something like that, because monitors can change over time too. So, but that's the most accurate way. And then if you are printing yourself, you want a product like this that will also calibrate your printer. And there's a few ways it does it, but one of the more common ones is it will actually print out a sheet of paper with a bunch of test squares on it, and then you'll use the sensor from this to kind of read those squares, and it can generate a profile for your printer too, and then you know when you print, your monitor is going to match the print output. So,
Okay.
yeah.
What about, I don't know if you get into this, but
Yeah.
favorite monitors? I mean, I've looked at Dell
Mm-hmm.
and BenQ,
Yeah.
and LG, but you mentioned Apple. I don't have an Apple computer, but I guess that doesn't.
Yeah, well, and I have an Apple laptop. I don't use Apple displays because their 5K display is like $6,000 or something like that. It's crazy. I actually did just buy a new monitor for my house recently. It's not full 4K resolution. It's a 2K resolution, and it was kind of just from a company I found that's a little bit newer in Southern California, but it got really good ratings. So company-wise, I don't specifically have one. BenQ is probably one of the better ones out there, especially if you can buy one of their photographic monitors that are made for photography, because there's a few things to look for in a monitor, no matter what the brand. BenQ typically will have most of these. The main difference with their photography monitors is they're going to be made to display more variety of colors, so a wider array of colors.
Right.
They also typically have actual memory built into the monitor itself, so when you set up a color calibration profile, you can actually save it into that monitor. Most of the time you're saving it on your computer, which means if you put that monitor on a different computer, it loses that profile, whereas the BenQs, you can save it into there, and they have a lot more controls for keeping that accurate and things like that. And sometimes they'll come with a shade too, kind of around the monitor, so you can get more contrast and not as much glare. So those are really nice, but they can be more expensive, especially if you want larger, higher resolution. And I personally wanted something a little higher than HD. I wanted something higher resolution. So the biggest thing to look for, though, is I would personally look for something that has an IPS panel. That's the type of technology they're using for the display. You might have heard of that. And then the other thing that I look at is the color gamut. So how many colors can it display? So if it's a standard monitor, it's probably in that, I forget exactly how much, but it's in the many, many thousands, like let's say 16 to 30,000 or something like that. I look for the ones that display closer to full sRGB or Adobe RGB, which are usually like 16 million and up. So the one that I have is more, it's a full, I think it's full sRGB and most of the Adobe RGB color gamut. And I also like full, if your monitor can work and do HDR, high dynamic range, that just means it can display a higher contrast between the lights and the shadows and everything. So mine can do HDR as well. And so then once it's color calibrated, I haven't actually color calibrated mine yet, I just got it. Then it should be able to give you very accurate colors and representation of your pictures better and everything. So the biggest thing for me was the IPS panel and the number of colors though. Some monitors will also, actually all the BenQ ones nowadays are what's called a low blue light monitor. You can turn that on or off. So it's better for your eyes, but what I found is that just makes the monitor very warm. So it's not necessarily always good for actual photography, unfortunately. Yeah, I tried it on mine and it makes it very warm. So I don't use that a whole lot unless I'm doing something else and I'm going to be just reading off of it for a while. So yeah, but that's the main things. Yeah, the IPS monitors will be more expensive. I think mine was about $600 after tax. So
Mine's like, tell me what your brand was or where you got it.
yeah, so mine, here, let me close these guys. Let me see if I can find it. Mine wasn't really made for photography. It's actually, they consider it more like a gaming monitor, but I got it because the specs are really nice because it was made for higher end.
Right. Or you can email me if you.
Yeah, no, it's these guys here.
Oh.
Which, like I said, they call it for gaming, but I shopped through Newegg online. Let me see.
Okay.
I specifically got this one here.
Okay.
And the reason I can show you is because, well, it's $3.99 now. Mine was a little bit more with the tax and everything. I did buy a couple other things, but so it's 2K resolution. It's not full 4K, but those were way more expensive. It refreshes really fast, so it doesn't strain your eyes as much. It's IPS with full colors. Let me see if it tells the... Oh, it can go vertical too. I actually want to get a second one so I can have a vertical one, so I can have, when I'm editing like a vertical portrait or something like that, I like that. It's really easy to switch too. Let me see here. Yeah, there we go, 95% DCI-P3. So it can display millions and millions of colors. When I was comparing monitors, I would put like, on Newegg you can do a comparison and see like several of them. And I would run into a lot of monitors at the same price point didn't show 16 million colors. They were at the much lower color thing, so that's what I ended up going. And it's HDR and everything. It just checked all the boxes. So there's 10-bit versus 8-bit. So yeah, it's the PX7 Prime. It's a pretty good deal, I think, for a 2K monitor. It looks beautiful. I love it.
Okay, thanks so much.
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
been for quite a while and I'm just stuck. I'm not sure which way to go.
Yeah, no, I hear you. It can be a hard process, and I'd love to have one of the BenQ photography monitors eventually, but the one I wanted that was 4K was going to be about $1,100, so it was
Exactly.
a little out of my price range for now. So yeah,
Right.
for sure. But cool, yeah, let me know how it goes in the search. If you have any questions, you can always send me a link to something you find, and I can help you compare and look at some of the other ones. And
Thank you so much. I appreciate
Yeah.
that.
yeah, of course. No, glad to help. So cool. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, that's pretty much it for today. So thanks for coming to another one of our classes. And we're going to have another free one tomorrow, I think it is, with Tamron, Mysteries of the Night Sky. So check that out. It's completely free. And then we'll have some more this Saturday and next Monday. So
Okay, thanks. Chris.
cool. All right. Thank you. Yeah. Everybody have a good day.